Welcome to CSS Breakdown, book by book, Season 05, Episode 08, where we crack open Andrew Heywood's foundational text, Political Theory. An introduction. Today, we're asking a question as old as political thought itself. What truly defines the relationship between the individual and the state? Now, this isn't just some dusty academic question, is it? It's really the bedrock of how societies function, from ancient Greece right up to, well, today's world. And Heywood's book, it's our map for this deep dive.
It absolutely is. And it's a question with answers that have, well, they've really shifted over time. You think back to ancient Greece, and citizen meant something quite specific. Usually, a freeborn man, owned property, lived in a city-state. A tiny minority, really.
Different from now.
Totally different. Our modern idea hinges on universal rights, obligations, ideas that got going in the 17th century with natural rights theory, and then really bloomed into human rights in the 20th. And Heywood throws down the gauntlet immediately, doesn't he? Like, what are rights?
Yeah, what do they even mean?
Yeah. Exactly. How far do they go? Who gets them? And crucially, what about the other side? The duties, the obligations we have to the state beyond just, having rights. So our mission, really, is to explore that balance. Citizenship. And acknowledging, as Heywood says, it comes with heavy ideological baggage.
Heavy ideological baggage. I like that phrase. It captures it well. So let's start unpacking that baggage. Maybe with the idea of rights itself. It's a word we use all the time. Right to free speech, right to work. Kids talking about their right to stay up late.
It's everywhere.
But Heywood makes a great point. Originally, right wasn't an entitlement like we think of it now. It was more like a power, a privilege.
Like the divine right of kings. Yeah,
exactly. Now it's an entitlement. And while most people accept rights exist, the arguments really start over why we have them, who has them, what their scope is. It gets contentious fast.
And the first big split, which Heywood highlights, is between legal and moral rights. That's key. Legal rights, well, they're written down in law, enforceable in court, and they exist whether we think they're morally right or wrong. Heywood uses that quite shocking UK example.
Oh, the marital rape one.
Yes. Until 1992, a husband legally couldn't be prosecuted for raping his wife. A legal right existed, regardless of the morality. It's a stark illustration. And even within legal rights, there's complexity. Hohfeld identified different types. You've got liberty rights.
Like using a public road.
Precisely. Freedom to act unless forbidden. Then claim rights, which means someone else has a duty. Your right not to be assaulted means others have a duty not to assault you.
Okay, so it's not just one thing.
Not at all. There are also legal powers, like the right to vote or marry, and immunities, like certain groups being exempt from military draft. It shows rights are, well, multifaceted.
That makes sense. And how do these legal rights actually get set up in different places, like, say, the UK versus the US?
That's a good contrast. Traditionally, the UK relied on common law rights were residual. Basically, anything was allowed unless the law said it wasn't.
A bit vague.
Could be. The Human Rights Act 1998 clarified things, brought in European Convention rights, but they aren't entrenched. Parliament can, technically, still legislate against them. Now, the U.S. is different. The Bill of Rights said those first 10 amendments, plus others later, they're part of higher law. Meaning courts can review laws and strike them down if they violate those rights. It's a check on government power, potentially stronger protection against overmighty government, as Heywood puts it.
But these bills of rights, they have downsides too, don't they? People argue against them.
Oh, absolutely. In the UK, some conservatives prefer the flexibility of common law, arguing bills of rights can be too rigid, maybe even artificial. Socialists sometimes worry they prioritize property rights and individual freedoms over social justice or necessary reforms.
And the power of judges.
That's a big one. It gives unelected judges significant power to make decisions that are essentially political. And here's the kicker. Just having a Bill of Rights doesn't automatically guarantee freedom. Think about the old Soviet Union. Their constitutions listed rights.
But they didn't mean much in practice.
Exactly. Because the courts just did what the party said. Or look at the U.S. 15th Amendment gave black men the vote in 1870. But in the South, various tactics meant they effectively couldn't vote until the 1960s.
So the paper guarantee isn't enough.
Not without genuine enforcement and political will. It shows the limits of just relying on legal documents. Now, shifting gears slightly, you have moral rights. These aren't legally enforceable. They're more like ethical claims.
Yeah, like keeping the promise.
Yeah, or rights based on what someone deserves from a moral standpoint, maybe religious beliefs. Jeremy Bentham, the utilitarian, famously called natural rights nonsense on stilts.
Harsh.
Very. But ironically, Heywood points out that major legal documents, the U.S. Bill of Rights, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, they grew out of these philosophical attempts to define the rights of man.
Okay, so moral rights were the philosophical spark. Let's really dig into human rights then. This feels like the big one, the universal idea.
It is. And their power comes partly from how they evolved out of those earlier natural rights ideas. Thinkers like John Locke talked about life, liberty, and property as natural, God-given, fundamental. Jefferson later adapted it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In the 20th century, this became more secularized human rights, and the core claims are that they're universal.
Belonging to everyone.
Everyone, regardless of nationality, race, religion, whatever, and they're inalienable.
Can't be taken away.
Right, like the American Declaration says. But then you hit the tricky questions like, are they truly absolute? What about the right to life versus self-defense?
And that fundamental question, who counts as human for these rights?
Exactly. That's where it gets really complex and often controversial. Think about debates over abortion, embryo research, when does human life with rights begin? And if rights are based on, say, the sacredness of life, where do animals stand? Or if they're based on capacity, rationality, self-consciousness, what about infants or people with profound cognitive disabilities?
It really forces you to confront deep ethical issues.
It does. It reveals how hard it is to draw neat lines around who gets these fundamental entitlements. And the claim of universality itself faces challenges. Remember the Asian values debate in the 80s and 90s?
Vaguely, leaders in places like Malaysia and Singapore.
Right. Mahathir Mohamad, Lee Kuan Yew. They argued Western human rights talk was too individualistic, neglecting Asian cultural emphasis on, social harmony, duty, respect for authority, family. The 1993 Bangkok Declaration reflected this. They weren't necessarily rejecting human rights entirely, but arguing for cultural context, suggesting the existing framework had a Western bias.
So a clash between universal claims and cultural specifics.
Pretty much. And though the 97-98 financial crisis quieted that specific debate for a bit, similar ideas resurfaced, especially with discussions around China and Confucianism. It shows universalism is often contested terrain. And this applies within societies, too, like with women's rights. Are they just human rights applied to women, equal pay, education?
Or they're distinct issues.
Exactly. Things specific to women, like reproductive rights, maternity leave. Then you get into things like reverse discrimination quotas to address past inequality. Are those temporary measures truly fundamental human rights if they aren't universal or permanent? It's thorny.
Okay, so given all these complexities and challenges, what are the main critiques leveled against the whole concept of human rights?
Well, you got Bentham's utilitarian dismissal nonsense on stilts. Only legal rights mattered to him. Then there are the Marxists. Marx saw the rights of man as fundamentally bourgeois, protecting private property, masking the exploitation inherent in capitalism, an ideological tool, essentially.
The stick system going.
Right. And more recently, post-colonial theorists have critiqued human rights discourse as a potential form of cultural imperialism, arguing it imposes Western values and overlooks diverse moral frameworks, sometimes reflecting Eurocentric biases.
So lots of pushback from different angles.
Definitely. It highlights the inherent tensions, individual versus society, universal claims versus cultural difference, idealism versus power politics.
Okay, let's push the boundaries even further. We've touched on animals, but what about this emerging debate on animal and other rights? That seems like a really significant step.
It is, and it follows logically if you question the basis of human rights. The late 20th century saw animal welfare, animal liberation movements really take off.
Campaigning against fur, animal testing for better farm conditions.
All that, often framed using the language of animal rights. And this fundamentally challenges that traditional Western, often Christian idea of humans having dominion over nature. It aligns more with some green theories or Eastern philosophies about interconnectedness. But there's a key split here, too, between animal welfare and animal rights.
What's the difference?
Peter Singer represents the animal welfare side. His focus is sentience, the capacity to suffer. He argues that avoiding pain is an equal interest for humans and animals, so speciesism, prejudice based on species, is irrational.
So minimize suffering.
Right, but not necessarily absolute rights. Then you have thinkers like Tom Reagan arguing for animal rights directly derived from human rights theory. If rights come from being a subject of a life, as he puts it, then many animals qualify. And his conclusion is radical.
That killing an animal is wrong.
As indefensible as killing a human, in his view, it forces a huge reevaluation. And it brings up those marginal cases again. If rights depend on rationality, what about humans who lack it versus highly intelligent animals like dolphins?
Very challenging questions. Where does it end? Plants.
Well, some researchers even explore plant sensitivity. Lyle Watson did work suggesting plants might feel pain. It echoes some Eastern religious views or even pre-Christian pagan beliefs about the sacredness of all life.
Wow. So the implication is what? A massive change in how we live.
Potentially, yes. Human progress has largely involved treating nature as a resource. Shifting that relationship has profound implications for our ethics, our society, everything.
Okay, that's a lot on rights. Let's flip the coin now and talk about obligations. An obligation is basically a duty, right? A requirement. You mentioned HLA Hart's distinction.
Yes, between being obliged forced, like a gunman example.
The cashier handing over money.
Right. They're obliged but have no moral obligation, versus having an obligation, which stems from a moral duty. And just like rights, we can distinguish between legal obligations, pay your taxes, and moral ones, keep your promises. But the core idea Heywood stresses is reciprocity. Rights and obligations are reverse sides of the same coin.
Makes sense.
If you have rights, the state usually has corresponding obligations. Negative rights mean the state must refrain from interfering. Positive rights mean the state must act, provide something. And conversely, individuals can't just be bundles of rights. An orderly and civilized life, as Heywood says, requires acknowledging obligations too. The big one here is political obligation. That's the fundamental duty of a citizen to accept the state's authority and obey its laws.
Unless you're an anarchist.
Exactly. Philosophical anarchists like Robert Paul Wolff argue there's no moral basis for such an obligation. But for most political theory, it's central.
So if we accept there is such an obligation, where does it come from? This brings us to that classic idea, the social contract.
Ah, yes, the social contract. Its roots go way back. Plato touches on it, but it really became dominant in early modern thought. Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and it pops up even in modern thinkers like Rawls. The basic idea is a contract, a voluntary agreement. A social contract is an agreement, maybe between citizens themselves or between citizens and the state. We agree to accept authority in exchange for benefits like order and protection. Plato's Credo gives an early version. Socrates argues that by choosing to live in Athens, benefiting from its laws and society, he implicitly promised to obey them, even when facing an unjust death sentence.
An unconditional obligation based on benefits received.
Pretty much. But critics ask, is an implicit promise really binding, especially if you're born somewhere? What if the state is bad? Can you even leave? Later contract theorists, like Hobbes and Locke, often use the idea of a hypothetical state of nature to explore why we'd agree to obey. Thomas Hobbes, writing during the English Civil War, argued in Leviathan for absolute obligation. Why? Because the alternative, the state of nature, was a war of all against all, utter chaos. Any government, even a terrible one, was better than that.
A pretty grim choice. Absolutism or anarchy.
That was his view. He prioritized order above all else.
But Locke offered something different, didn't he? A bit more balanced.
Much more. John Locke argued for conditional obligation. He envisioned two contracts, sort of, one among people to form society, and then a trust between that society and the government. The government's job, to protect natural rights, life, liberty, property.
And if it doesn't?
Then the deal's off. If the government becomes tyrannical, breaks that trust, the people have a right of rebellion. This wasn't about dissolving society itself, just removing the failed government. He saw the Glorious Revolution of 1688 in England as an example. Then you have Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He wrote The Social Contract and was generally more optimistic about human nature. For Rousseau, legitimate government had to be based on the general will, the common good, what's best for everyone, not just powerful individuals.
The collective interest.
Right. And by consenting to be part of that community, you agree to abide by the general will. He even had that famous controversial idea that people could be forced to be free.
How did that work?
His thinking was, if you're blinded by selfishness or ignorance to what's really in your best interest, which aligns with the general will, then making you follow the general will is actually liberating you, making you obey your own true self. Deep stuff.
Okay, so social contracts are one major justification. But what are the alternatives? You mentioned natural duty.
Yes. Critics say contract theory doesn't always fit. Many obligations we feel like family duties don't come from explicit agreements. Plus, contract theory can make society seem like just a tool we created, maybe missing how society shapes us and gives us duties. Some theories ground obligation in the results the state provides good things, like order or welfare, utilitarianism, for example. But natural duty suggests membership in society isn't just a choice, it's somehow natural. So political obligation becomes a natural duty, not something we volunteer for. Socrates feeling indebted to Athens fits this. Conservatives often lean towards this. They see society as organic, growing naturally. Institutions like family, state, they aren't just invented contracts, they arise from necessity. So individuals are shaped by society and inherit responsibilities, obey laws, respect authority, much like children have duties to parents who raised them.
And socialists.
Socialists and social democrats also emphasize duty, but more through the lens of community and cooperation. Social duty is how you express responsibility to fellow members of the community. They often argue for stronger obligations, contribute to welfare, work for the common good, warning that a purely rights-focused society abandons the vulnerable. Even some anarchists, communitarian ones, talk about social obligations, just not to a state.
So the core idea is that obligation might stem from simply being part of a human community, not just a deal you struck.
That's a good way to put it. It's less about consent, more about inherent connection and responsibility.
Which brings us to the breaking point. When do these obligations end? Let's talk about rebellion and the limits of obligation.
Right. If political obligation is the duty to obey, then reaching its limit implies a right, an entitlement, as Heywood puts it, to disobey potentially through rebellion. Rebellion aims to overthrow state power, often violently. It's usually distinguished from revolution, which might involve deeper social transformation.
And when is it justified?
Well, one clear case is if the authority was never legitimate in the first place, like colonial rule, where the subjects never really acknowledged a duty to obey the colonizer. But the classic justification comes back to Locke.
And the American Revolution.
Exactly. The revolutionaries use Lockean language heavily. Government gets its power from the consent of the governed specifically to protect inalienable rights. So if the government stops doing that, becomes a despotism, then the obligation dissolves. It becomes not just a right, but maybe even a duty to alter or abolish it. Obligation is clearly limited. But of course, not everyone agrees on these limits. Liberals tend to follow Locke. If the state fails its side of the contract, obligation ceases. Authoritarian conservatives, though, channeling Hobbes, warn that any challenge to authority risks chaos. Questioning obligation is dangerous. Thinkers like Joseph de Maistre felt this strongly.
And Marxists. They wouldn't accept the premise anyway.
Pretty much. For Marxists, the bourgeois state is inherently an instrument of class oppression. Talk of political obligation is just ideology, a myth to keep workers in line. There's no real obligation to an oppressive system. And anarchists agree, though, for different reasons. If the state itself is inherently coercive and harmful, then any obligation to obey it is unfounded, basically servitude.
So a huge range of views on when or even if we should obey.
Absolutely. It cuts to the heart of debates about authority, freedom, and justice.
Okay, this is the perfect point to bring everything together with the concept of citizenship. It seems to be the thread connecting rights and obligations. I know it goes back to the Greeks, the Republican tradition. A citizen is a member of a political community with rights and obligations. But the debates continue. Is it just legal status? Is it about identity? What's the right mix?
Precisely. Citizenship isn't simple. It has that legal substance, what rights differentiate a citizen from an alien, living, working, voting. But crucially, it also has that subjective or psychological side. It's a frame of mind, Heywood says. A feeling of loyalty, belonging, willingness to participate or defend the state.
Which explains why some groups might feel like second-class citizens, even if they legally have rights.
Exactly. If you face constant discrimination or disadvantage, that feeling of belonging, a full membership, can be undermined. And T.H. Marshall's work here, Citizenship and Social Class from 1950, is foundational. He defines citizenship as full membership of a community. And he traced its evolution in the UK through 3 bundles of rights. First, civil rights, basic individual freedoms. Speech, property, equality before the law. These require limited government.
The classic liberal rights.
Yes. Then, political rights. The right to participate, vote, hold office. Requires democracy, political equality. And finally, crucially, social rights. These guarantee a basic standard of living welfare, social security, education enough to live a civilized being, according to the standards of the society. This links citizenship directly to the welfare state.
So for Marshall, citizenship wasn't just legal status, it needed social foundations too.
That's the key insight. Real citizenship, real participation requires more than just formal permission. It requires the actual capability, often supported by social provision.
Marshall's framework is influential, but I assume it's been challenged over the years?
Oh, definitely. The new right, starting in the 70s and 80s, strongly attacked the idea of social rights, arguing they created dependency and overburdened the state. Others have proposed adding more rights, economic rights like union rights or specific feminist rights, addressing gender inequality, reproductive issues. And as we see globalization increase, the idea of global citizenship adds another layer Marshall didn't really foresee. But Marshall, and Heywood echoing him, stresses that citizenship isn't just rights. It demands duties and responsibilities. Often these mirror the rights. Right to privacy, duty to respect others' privacy, political rights, duty to participate, vote, maybe jury service, even compulsory voting in some places.
Right, the other side of the coin again.
Exactly. And underlying this is what Derek Heater called civic virtue, that sense of loyalty, willingness to accept communal responsibilities. Heater argued this isn't automatic. It requires citizenship education. Heater also talked about multiple citizenship. We don't just belong to a nation state, do we? We have loyalties to regions, local communities, maybe ethnic or religious groups, even international bodies or a sense of global community.
So citizenship is layered.
It can be. Liberal democracies usually accept this, recognizing spheres of life outside state control. Limited citizenship. Totalitarian states like Nazi Germany demanded total citizenship where state obligations were absolute.
This leads nicely into the debate between social citizenship and active citizenship. They sound like opposing views on what citizenship should prioritize.
They definitely represent different emphases. Social citizenship, building on Marshall, stresses universal quality, equal rights, and entitlements. Its core idea is that citizenship combats social inequality. Marshall said they were opposing principles. This view gained ground in the 20th century with civil rights movements, the UN Declaration including social rights, and the rise of the welfare state.
Who supports this view mainly?
Social democrats, socialists, modern liberals. They champion positive rights, government intervention, arguing that without addressing economic inequality, formal citizenship rights can be hollow. Social rights are seen as foundational. Active citizenship, on the other hand, is largely a critique from the political right. Libertarians argue social rights create unrealistic expectations, high taxes, and sap initiative. The New Right had two main strands here. The liberal New Right, neoliberals, focused on individualism, active citizenship, meant enterprise, self-reliance, hard work. Good for the economy and good for individual dignity.
Less reliance on the state.
Exactly. The conservative New Right, neoconservatives, focused more on obligations over entitlements. Think JFK's famous line, "Ask not what your country can do for you."
Ask what you can do for your country.
Right. They argued Marshall's citizenship of entitlement led to selfishness, social breakdown. Communitarian thinkers sometimes echo this. Things like shifting from student grants to loans reflect this emphasis on individual responsibility.
But what are the criticisms of this active citizenship model?
Critics worry it just swaps one imbalance for another. Too much focus on duty might sideline legitimate rights claims, and promoting a pay-your-way ethos could end up reinforcing existing inequalities rather than challenging them. It risks blaming individuals for structural problems.
Okay, one final area within citizenship, the tension between universal citizenship and diversity. How does the traditional model cope with modern multicultural societies?
The traditional liberal model is universalist. All citizens get the same rights and duties. It's based on separating the public sphere, where we're all equal citizens, from the private sphere, where our differences, religion, culture belong. It aims to be difference blind regarding public status. And historically, this was radical and emancipatory. Civil rights movements fought for this kind of equal, universal citizenship against discrimination. But as societies become more diverse, this universalism gets questioned. Does difference blind actually mean imposing the norms of the dominant group? Thinkers like Iris Marion Young argued for differentiated citizenship. She said maybe we need special rights alongside universal ones to account for group differences and overcome disadvantage.
Special rights based on what?
Could be biological factors, specific needs of women, the disabled, elderly, or cultural factors, rights to help minority groups maintain their identity or overcome systemic obstacles. Will Kimlicka developed a liberal theory of minority rights to accommodate this. He proposed things like self-government rights for national minorities, like indigenous groups, maybe devolution or federalism, polyethnic rights for immigrant groups, legal exemptions to allow cultural practices like religious dress codes or ritual slaughter were compatible with basic rights, and representation rights, measures like quotas to address underrepresentation of certain groups in politics.
It sounds like an attempt to make universalism more responsive to difference. But surely there are potential problems with granting group-specific rights.
Absolutely. Critics like Brian Barry raise serious concerns. Can deep diversity be reconciled with liberal values if it means tolerating illiberal practices within minority groups? Where do you draw the line? Human rights and individual liberties usually take precedence. Polyethnic rights can also be seen as weakening civic unity. The French ban on religious symbols in schools is partly justified on maintaining secularism and gender equality across the board. And it leads to really difficult conflicts, like the right not to be offended versus free speech. The Salman Rushdie affair is a classic, painful example. Liberalism traditionally defends free expression, even offensive expression, Voltaire's famous line.
I detest what you say, but will defend to the death your right to say it.
Exactly. Balancing group recognition, individual freedom, and social cohesion in diverse societies. It's perhaps the defining challenge for citizenship today.
And that brings us almost to the end of this deep dive into Andrew Heywood's political theory. We've certainly unpacked a lot. The complexity of that relationship between the individual and the state rights, obligations, citizenship, it's clear how interconnected and, frankly, contested it all is. Heywood really gives us the tools to see those interactions.
He certainly does. It's a framework that shows these aren't static concepts. They're constantly evolving, constantly challenging each other. And maybe a final thought for you to chew on. As our world gets even more interconnected, more diverse, and technology keeps changing everything, what new duties might arise? For us as individuals, for states, and how will our ideas of rights and obligations themselves need to adapt if we want to build genuine global citizenship while still holding our diverse societies together? It's a huge question for the future.